Cold is not just weather. In the far north, it behaves like a predator. It slides under doors, it bites through cloth, it steals heat so quietly you only notice when your hands stop working and your thoughts turn slow. Now imagine living through weeks of that with temperatures dropping tens of degrees below 0 degrees Celsius in a home built from wood and earth. Most people picture a Viking village as a line of frozen huts buried in snow waiting to fail. But the uncomfortable truth is better than the myth. Those communities did not only survive, they stayed productive, fed their animals, raised children, and even held feasts when the storms outside were screaming. Outside the village looks silent, but silence is a lie. Snow squeaks under boots. Wind makes the roofline groan. Frost creeps into every seam it can find. If you step outside too long, your fingers stop obeying you. That is why the question feels impossible. How do you stay warm in a world that wants you numb, in a house that does not have brick walls, thick glass windows, or a metal stove? People love to say Vikings were just tougher. That answer is lazy. Toughness does not stop drafts. Toughness does not prevent rot. Toughness does not keep a roof from leaking meltwater into bedding. Engineering does. You can almost hear the settlement at night, a muffled roar of wind outside, then a softer world inside where the sound is absorbed by thick walls. That muffling is not mood. It is proof. When a house is tight and heavy, it eats noise and it also slows heat loss. In a thin cabin, you hear everything and you feel everything. In a longhouse, you feel the storm, but it does not cut straight through you. You do not beat winter by bravado. You beat it by removing opportunities for heat to escape. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Their secret was not magic. It was brutal, practical engineering. A Viking longhouse was not a simple shelter. It was a unified heat preservation system where every element worked together. The shape fought wind, the walls trapped still air, the roof sealed moisture out, and the entrances refused draft. Even daily life inside the house, where people gathered close and shared warmth, was part of the design. Stay with me, because the final pieces explain why these houses could feel warmer than many modern buildings. Not cleaner, not brighter, warmer. Think of it like a chain. Break one link and the whole plan fails. If the foundation stays wet, the frame rots. If the frame shifts, gaps open. If gaps open, wind enters. If wind enters, the hearth works harder. If the hearth works harder, fuel runs out. So the longhouse was designed as a complete system that avoided weak links. It also forced good habits. The house punished careless doors. It rewarded careful maintenance. In winter, you did not set and forget your home. You ran it like you ran a boat in rough water. This is why the story is not about one trick. It is about stacking defenses. Each defense multiplies the next. A draft-free door makes the hearth more effective. A dry foundation makes the wall tighter. A tight wall makes body heat matter. And once you see the stack, you stop asking, how did they survive? And start asking, why do we waste so much heat today? You do not beat winter by bravado. You beat it by removing opportunities for heat to escape. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. And here's the first cliffhanger. The longhouse was designed like a living creature you had to operate every day. If you used it right, it protected you. If you used it carelessly, winter punished you. Next, we begin with the outside, because the Vikings learned the first lesson of warmth from the sea. If you can make winds slide past you, you can keep heat trapped inside. So keep a builder's mindset while listening. Every detail is a heat decision. Every choice is a fight against wind moisture and wasted warmth. And the best part is that none of it requires modern technology. It requires smart trade-offs. Next, we start with the first trade-off. The longhouse did not try to stand tall. It crouched low and long so storms could slide over it instead of tearing it open. So keep your eyes open for the pattern block wind, keep things dry, trap air, and concentrate light. Those 4 rules repeat again and again. Next, we watch the first rule in action: wind control, and we see how the longhouse shape turns a violent blast into a sliding flow. You do not beat winter by bravado. You beat it by removing opportunities for heat to escape. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place. The Scandinavians were ship people. They spent years learning how wind behaves over hulls and sails. On water, sharp corners get hammered. Flat surfaces get slammed. Curves survive. That knowledge walked onto land. Many longhouses stretched for 30 meters and some approached 80 meters with walls that gently bowed like the sides of a ship. This was not for beauty. It was for survival. A curved profile makes the wind flow around the structure instead of punching at full force, which means fewer gaps open over time and fewer drafts hunt through the seams. A long, low profile also changes how snow behaves. Snow does not slam into the walls the way rain does. It drifts, piles, and packs. A roof with smooth lines and a steady slope helps snow settle in predictable ways. That matters because unpredictable snow load can break rafters. Viking builders wanted predictable load and predictable wind flow. The curve and length were not aesthetic. They were a weather strategy. The house was shaped to reduce the hammering that slowly loosens joints over a long season. Even the roofline helped with wind. A steep roof can catch gusts like a sail. A lower profile reduces lift. Less lift means fewer storms trying to peel the roof away. When snow adds weight, that weight can actually stabilize the structure as long as the rafters are strong. Viking builders understood load and pressure without writing equations. They learned it through seasons of survival and repair. This is why longhouses feel engineered. They are shaped by repeated winters, not by guesswork. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Inside that giant roof, the entire community clustered together. There were no modern rooms divided by doors that create cold pockets. The head of the family, relatives, workers, and sometimes enslaved people lived in one long interior, sharing heat whether they wanted to or not. It sounds crowded, but it was a smart trade. Dozens of bodies add warmth with every breath. When you pack warm life into a protected shell, the temperature rises faster and falls slower. The longhouse was designed to keep the warm zone where people actually sat, worked, and slept, not to heat empty air high above their heads. This shared interior also meant shared resources. One hearth could heat many people. One stock of fuel could be guarded. One roof could be repaired quickly by many hands if a storm damaged an edge. And because the house had few internal doors, heat spread more evenly. Cold corners were less likely. Even the benches and working areas were placed with warmth in mind. You did your slow winter work where the air stayed stable, mending, carving, weaving, repairing tools. The longhouse was a winter workshop as much as a bedroom. Winter also changes social life. When daylight is short, the house becomes the world. Stories, songs, tool-making, and quiet planning all happen in the warm zone. That is why heat is not only comfort. It is productivity. Cold hands cannot weave fine wool or carve clean wood. The longhouse kept hands working, which kept the community ahead of the season. This is why longhouses feel engineered. They are shaped by repeated winters, not by guesswork. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. So the shape fought wind and the people added heat. But the real armor was the wall itself. Next, you will see how the Vikings built a thermal barrier so thick it behaves like a giant thermos, using materials that were available even when good timber was scarce. But shape and social warmth are only the first layer. The next layer is physical insulation. In the next part, you will see why Viking builders cared about cardinal directions, why entrances avoided the end walls, and how a wall made from turf can trap warmth the way a modern insulated panel does. Now we go from form to substance. The next part shows the materials that make the longhouse feel like a sealed container: stone to fight rot, turf to trap air, and careful placement to prevent wind from finding a straight path through the building. This is why longhouses feel engineered. They are shaped by repeated winters, not by guesswork. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place. When you hear Viking house, you might imagine logs stacked like a cabin. That image collapses in places like Iceland and Greenland, where wood was precious. The Vikings used wood only where it was unavoidable: the skeleton. First, they laid a belt of large flat stones around the perimeter of the building. This stone line leveled the ground and, more importantly, kept the wooden frame away from damp soil so it would not rot. Rot creates weakness, and weakness becomes a draft. A draft in Arctic winter is not a nuisance, it is a threat. Viking builders also oriented longhouses with intention. They paid attention to prevailing winds and sun. The goal was simple: expose less of the building to the harshest winter blasts. Entrances were almost never placed on the end walls that faced the strongest weather. Instead, doors were set into the long side walls, sometimes protected by extra wall extensions or earth banks. This stopped the house from becoming a wind tunnel. When you control where air can enter, you control how heat stays. Cardinal direction planning also reduced stress on doors. A door facing the wrong wind gets battered, and battered doors leak. By placing entrances on sheltered long walls and using extensions, builders created calmer air at the doorway. Calm air means less pressure pushing cold inside. It is a small detail with huge payoff when you open that door dozens of times a day. Once you notice the pattern, the rest of the design becomes predictable, and that predictability is the point. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Then came the posts, thick timbers dug deep to carry the massive roof. Between those posts, the Vikings packed the true insulation material of their world: turf. Turf is not loose dirt. It is earth-bound tightly by grass roots cut into rectangular blocks, like giant bricks. Those blocks were stacked into walls that could reach 1.5 meters thick at the base, sometimes close to 2 meters, narrowing toward the top for stability. Builders laid blocks in dense patterns and interlocked them to eliminate gaps. The secret inside turf is still air. The porous soil and roots hold countless tiny air pockets, and still air is one of the best insulators in nature. Turf blocks were stacked like a careful puzzle. A sloppy stack leaves cracks. Cracks become drafts. So builders used tight patterns, sometimes angled like herringbone, sometimes interlocked like hands gripping, to increase density. The thickness at the base created stability, and the narrowing toward the top prevented collapse. When winter winds hit, the wall did not rattle like thin boards. It behaved like an embankment, and because wood was valuable, using turf for walls saved timber for the roof skeleton and for the hearth. Turf was also efficient to harvest compared to hauling timber long distances. Communities could cut turf blocks in warm seasons, stack them while the soil was cooperative, then rely on that thickness through winter. And if a section eroded, you did not need a sawmill. You needed labor knowledge and a good spade. That is a resilient technology. Once you notice the pattern, the rest of the design becomes predictable, and that predictability is the point. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. If you are wondering whether a wall made of earth can really defend against winter, the next step will surprise you. These walls did not stay dead and static. They grew, tightened, and blended into the land itself, and then the longhouse added a heat source that breathes. Next, we step into the part modern viewers call shocking, but Vikings called common sense. You might be thinking, earth walls sound damp. That is the next twist. Vikings fought moisture as aggressively as they fought cold. Stone foundations, careful layering, and living grass surfaces all worked to keep the walls stable. And once the walls were stable, the longhouse could add a heat source most people never expect. Next, we step to the stalls where warmth is generated without burning anything at all. The longhouse is starting to look less like a cabin and more like a system you maintain. That maintenance mindset is why it worked. Next, we turn fully toward heat generation, because insulation without heat is just a box. The Vikings filled that box with living warmth in a way that modern people rarely consider. Once you notice the pattern, the rest of the design becomes predictable, and that predictability is the point. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place. Turf is alive. Over time, grass can grow back on the outside of the wall, and roots knit the stacked blocks into a tougher, denser mass. From a distance, a longhouse could look like a low green mound, a natural hill with smoke rising from a roof opening. That blending mattered. A house that merges with the landscape has fewer sharp edges for wind to grab. It also encourages snow to drift smoothly against it, later sealing cracks instead of exposing them. In spring, the longhouse could look almost peaceful. Grass on the wall, grass on the roof. A building that seems to disappear into the ground. But that gentle look hides hard logic. Roots reduce erosion from rain and meltwater. Roots hold turf blocks in place so fewer gaps form. Fewer gaps means fewer drafts when winter returns. In a way, the longhouse used biology as reinforcement. The building improved itself over time as long as people maintained it. A grassy exterior also helped with rain. Water running down a living surface is slowed and spread, reducing harsh channels that can cut into the wall. Less cutting means fewer weak spots. Fewer weak spots means fewer emergency repairs in freezing weather. The wall becomes calmer and more predictable across the year. A longhouse is not pretty comfort. It is controlled discomfort that keeps you alive. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking, applied again and again. Thick earth changes temperature slowly. That is the advantage. Even if the outside surface is frozen, the interior surface can stay closer to the indoor temperature, which reduces the feeling of radiant cold when you sit near the wall. Thermal mass buys time. If the fire dips, the room does not crash into deadly cold immediately. The walls, the stones at the base, and the heavy roof layers all slow the fall. In winter, slow change is safety. And because turf is local, repairs are possible. Replace a block pack, a seam with moss, tighten the skin of the house before the next storm. Thermal mass also changes how a room feels. Even if the air temperature is not high, a stable wall surface reduces the sense of biting chill. That is why people could sit along the walls on benches and still feel protected, especially with wool and skin. The house stored warmth during active hours and released it slowly when the fire was lower. That slow release matters most in the dangerous hours before dawn, when a weak fire and a strong storm can turn a small problem into an emergency. The interior also avoided direct contact with the cold ground. People sat and slept on raised platforms and the working passage stayed lower. Cold air sinks. By living higher, you live warmer. It is such a simple idea, but it changes your nightly survival when the floor is earthen and the outside world is trying to drag heat downward. A longhouse is not pretty comfort. It is controlled discomfort that keeps you alive. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful layered thinking applied again and again. Now comes the reveal that makes people grimace. Vikings did not rely on fire alone. They used living heat. In the next part, you will see why the longhouse was also a winter barn, why that was an engineering decision, and why the warmth came with a price most modern people would struggle to pay. And emergencies in winter often start with fuel. If wood is scarce, you cannot waste it. So Vikings found another steady heat source and pulled it under the same roof. Next, we get to the living heater that shocked modern viewers, the animals that warmed the house with their bodies while the house protected them from wind chill. Now take that stable interior and add the sound of animals shifting in straw. It is strange to us, but to Vikings, it meant security. A living herd is stored food and stored heat. Next, we step into that symbiosis and see how the barn and the hearth cooperate like two engines in the same machine. A longhouse is not pretty comfort. It is controlled discomfort that keeps you alive. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place. The Vikings shared their homes with animals through the winter, not as a cute story, but as a survival strategy. A longhouse was often divided into two zones, a living area and a barn area. About half of the building, sometimes more, could be stalls for cows, sheep, goats, and horses. Livestock were wealth food, future labor, and transport. If you lost them in winter, you lost spring. A separate barn could freeze through in brutal weather, and animals weakened by wind chill could die quickly. Under one roof, the herd stayed protected. The longhouse was a winter ark. It carried the household through the season when the outside world could not be trusted. Bringing animals inside also reduced labor risk. Walking to a separate barn in a storm is dangerous. Snow hides holes. Ice breaks ankles. Wind erases direction. Under one roof, feeding and checking animals was faster and safer. It also prevented predators from taking advantage of winter weakness. In the dark season, you keep what matters close. This arrangement also reduced travel. Every trip outside costs heat and risks injury. When feeding, milking, or checking animals can be done indoors, you save energy and you stay safer. It also meant the household could notice problems quickly before an animal collapsed from cold stress or sickness. Every breath, every animal body, every hot stone adds to the same equation: keep warmth inside the shell. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful layered thinking applied again and again. The division between people and animals was usually a simple wooden partition, not airtight, not sealed. It marked the boundary but allowed heat to move. The physics is simple and ruthless. Large animals generate heat constantly. A group of cows is a heating system that runs day and night without burning a single stick of wood. Builders helped convection do the work by keeping the living floor slightly higher than the barn floor. Warm air rises. Heat from the stalls drifted upward and mixed with hearth warmth. Yes, there were drawbacks, especially smell. But in a world where survival mattered more than comfort, the smell was a tax they paid without hesitation. The layout created a gentle gradient of warmth. The hearth warmed the center. Animals warmed the stall zone. Warm air rose and drifted toward the higher living area. Meanwhile, the barn floor stayed lower to keep waste contained and bedding absorbed moisture. It was not clean by modern standards, but it was organized for survival. The smell was real. The smoke was real. Yet the payoff was huge, a steadier interior temperature with less fuel burned and a herd that survived until spring. Do not imagine luxury. Imagine strategy. The partition was not about comfort. It was about airflow. Too sealed, and the barn becomes damp. Too open, and odors and moisture overwhelm the living zone. The Vikings were constantly balancing heat, air, and dryness. That balance is why the longhouse feels like something you operate rather than simply occupy. Every breath, every animal body, every hot stone adds to the same equation: keep warmth inside the shell. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Once you accept animals as part of the heating plan, the next enemy becomes clear. Heat sources do nothing if wind steals their work. So next we move to the Viking war on drafts and the extreme choices they made, including darkness, low doorways, and airlock entrances that trapped warmth like a snare. Now imagine opening a door in that setup. One careless open door can dump warm air into the storm and pull icy air across sleeping benches. So the Vikings treated drafts like an enemy raid. Next, we go into their most extreme anti-draft choices: almost no windows, low doors that force quick entry, and vestibules that trap cold air before it reaches the warm core. And once you operate a system, your biggest enemy becomes sudden change. A sudden blast of wind through a door can undo hours of careful warming. Next, we see the Viking obsession with controlling openings from low doors to vestibules that function like a trap for cold air. Every breath, every animal body, every hot stone adds to the same equation: keep warmth inside the shell. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place. The main enemy of warmth in the north is not simply cold. It is moving air. Wind pushes into the smallest cracks and pulls heat out faster than you can replace it. That is why longhouses had almost no windows. Glass was rare, and even a small opening is a weak point in a thermal fortress. Some houses had tiny slits for light, but in winter those slits were plugged with moss straw or wooden stoppers. Life took place in semi-darkness, and the Vikings accepted it because darkness does not freeze you, but drafts can. A window is comfort in summer, but in winter it is a hole in your armor. Vikings understood that. Glass was rare and expensive, mostly reserved for churches, so ordinary homes avoided it. Even when small openings existed, they were tiny and temporary. In deep winter, they were plugged tight with moss straw or wood. That meant months of dim light. But the Vikings made the trade because light can be created by fire, while lost heat is harder to replace when fuel is limited. Living in semi-darkness also changes behavior. People stay closer to the hearth, closer to each other, and closer to the warmest zone. That naturally concentrates heat where it matters most. In winter, the house teaches you to live efficiently. You do not wander into cold corners when you cannot even see them well. Draft control is not optional. It is the difference between a warm corner and a miserable, dangerous house. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Doors were treated like a dangerous wound in the wall. Doorways were low, forcing you to bend, which reduced the rush of cold air when the door opened. Doors were heavy, thick, and fitted tight. Many rotated on strong wooden pins set into grooves instead of modern hinges, which helped minimize gaps. Even more important, entrances were often protected by a vestibule, a small unheated entry space that worked like an airlock. You entered the vestibule, closed the outer door, shook snow off, then opened the inner door into the warm room. This prevented icy wind from charging straight into the living space and kept moisture from melting into the house. The entrance system was also about moisture control. Snow on cloaks and boots melts inside. Meltwater soaks bedding and makes the air feel colder. The vestibule acted like a trap. Shake snow off there, leave wet gear there, then step into the main room dryer. Doors were fitted to reduce gaps and entrances were placed so they were not directly opposite each other. That prevented a straight draft line that could blow through the building like a spear. The vestibule also offered a psychological reward. You step into cold first, then you enter warmth. That contrast makes the warm room feel like a shield. And because the entry is controlled, the warm room stays predictable. Predictable warmth is what allows rest, and rest is what keeps a community alive when the season is long. Draft control is not optional. It is the difference between a warm corner and a miserable, dangerous house. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Now we reach the heart of the longhouse, the fire. But here is the cliffhanger. Vikings did not have chimneys the way we do, yet they did not all suffocate. The next part explains the long central hearth, the smoke layer under the roof, and the clever adjustable roof opening that balanced warmth against breathing air. All of that draft control sets up the next challenge. If you seal a house, well, smoke becomes a bigger problem. The longhouse hearth brought warmth and light, but it also filled the roof space with smoke. Next, we learn how the Vikings handled that balance without modern chimneys and how smoke strangely became part of the longhouse's preservation plan. Now we face the fire. It gives life, but it also threatens life. The next part shows how Vikings used a long hearth heat storing stones and roof ventilation to turn a risky open flame into controlled, dependable warmth. Draft control is not optional. It is the difference between a warm corner and a miserable, dangerous house. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place. The longhouse hearth was not a neat fireplace in a corner. It was often a long, shallow pit running along the central axis of the living area, sometimes stretching 10 to 15 meters. Stone lined the edges to contain the fire and to store heat. Those stones absorbed warmth and released it slowly, acting like a heat battery through the night. The hearth was a 3-in-1 machine: heat, light, and cooking. Cauldrons hung above the flames on chains or tripods. Stews simmered. Water heated. Tools warmed in ready hands. In a house with no windows, firelight was the sun. The hearth was long for a reason. A small fire in one spot creates hot and cold zones. A long fire spreads heat along the axis of the building, making the room more even. People sat on benches along the walls, facing inward, sharing the warmest air and the light. The hearth also dried clothing, warmed tools, and kept food safe from freezing. The longhouse was a place where warmth supported work and work supported survival. Even the placement of seating matters. Benches along the walls keep bodies away from the damp central floor.
Skins and wool add insulation.
People often slept in their everyday clothing to conserve warmth. Servants or enslaved people might sleep closer to the hearth or nearer the utility zones, showing that warmth was also a social resource in the longhouse. Fire is both friend and threat, so the Vikings treated it like a tool that must be managed, not trusted. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking, applied again and again. But an open hearth brings smoke, and without a chimney, the problem looks deadly. The Vikings solved it with compromise and control. Smoke rose and gathered in the upper space under the roof, forming a hot layer above human head height. That layer was unpleasant, but it also helped preserve the wooden rafters by smoking them, discouraging insects and slowing decay. Smoke still had to escape, so builders created a roof opening above the hearth. The opening could be covered and adjusted with a wooden shield controlled by a long pole. In storms, it could be closed down to keep warmth. In calmer weather, it could be opened to clear air. Managing that balance was a daily skill, not a one-time invention. The adjustable roof opening, sometimes called a smoke vent, was not a simple hole. It was managed like a valve. On calm days, it could open more to clear the air. On storm days, it stayed mostly closed, leaving only a narrow gap so the warmest air did not escape. The upper smoke layer also reduced insect damage and slowed rot by smoking the wood. It was uncomfortable, but it extended the life of the structure and reduced the need for scarce timber repairs. The smoke layer also served as a crude insulation buffer. Hot air wants to rise and escape. By allowing hot, smoky air to pool and escape slowly through a narrow opening, the house reduces the speed of heat loss. It is not pleasant air, but it is controlled heat. That is the core Viking trade: accept discomfort, avoid death. Fire is both friend and threat, so the Vikings treated it like a tool that must be managed, not trusted. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Now we climb to the final shield, the roof, because if heat escapes upward, everything else fails. In the next part, you will see why Viking roofs were layered like armor, how birch bark created waterproof skin, how turf added insulation, and how snow became the last outer blanket that sealed the entire house against wind. Now the final layer waits above. Even a perfect hearth and thick walls fail if the roof leaks heat and water. In the next part, we climb into the roof-build decking, birch bark waterproofing, turf insulation, and then the winter blanket that completes the system: snow that seals the outside and turns the longhouse into a warm capsule. With fire understood, the last puzzle is the roof. A roof must keep water out, hold snow weight, and stop heat from leaking upward. Next, we break down the roof layers and the final winter trick that makes the village look buried while staying warmer inside. Fire is both friend and threat, so the Vikings treated it like a tool that must be managed, not trusted. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place. A Viking roof was built to fight weight, water, and cold at the same time. First came a strong rafter framework, then laths and decking. Above that, Vikings laid birch bark in overlapping sheets like shingles. Birch bark contains natural resins that resist water, making it an effective waterproof layer. On top of the bark, they placed 2, sometimes 3 layers of turf blocks. This heavy earth coat could weigh several tons, which is why the wood skeleton had to be strong. In return, the roof trapped heat and protected the bark from sunlight and damage. Over time, grass could grow on the roof and roots bound the turf into a single tough cover. The house literally grew into the land. Birch bark was laid in overlapping sheets so water ran down in a way the same logic used in modern shingles. Turf above protected the bark from sunlight and damage, keeping it flexible instead of brittle. The roof became a layered barrier structure for strength bark for waterproofing, turf for insulation, and living grass for binding. That is why the roof could handle long wet seasons and then freeze without falling apart immediately. Heavy, yes, but reliable. A roof like this is heavy, but heavy is not always bad in winter. Weight presses layers together and reduces gaps. Reduced gaps means less wind infiltration. Combined with thick walls, the roof completes the sealed envelope. The longhouse becomes less like a tent and more like an insulated container. And when snow seals the outside, the system reaches peak efficiency like a layered coat around a living core. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Then winter delivered the final gift, snow. Snow can lie for 6 to 8 months in the north, and the Vikings used it as free insulation. Drifts piled against turf walls and settled on turf roofs, turning houses into white mounds, with only entrances and smoke vents visible. Snow traps still air, and still air blocks heat loss. A compacted layer around 1 meter thick can create a thermal cocoon, sealing small gaps where wind might enter. Under that snow armor, the surface of the walls can stay near 0 degrees Celsius even when the air outside drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Inside, raised benches along the walls kept sleepers above the coldest air near the floor, close to stored warmth. Snow finished the job by adding another insulating layer and by blocking wind at the wall surface. Drifts piled against the house until it looked buried, but buried meant sealed. Under that snow cover, the wall surface stayed near 0 degrees Celsius even when outside air dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Inside, the longhouse layout helped. 2 raised benches kept sleepers above the coldest air near the floor, and the central passage allowed fire tending without stepping into the cold corners. Even separate buildings like smithies were designed for winter, often built as semi-dugouts about 1 meter deep, using the ground to stabilize temperature and block wind. And the story does not end at the longhouse. Settlements also used specialized buildings, built for winter survival smithies, placed at a safe distance to reduce fire risk. Workshops dug partly into the earth to use the ground's stable temperature, and even small steam rooms where heated stones met water to create warming steam. Every structure shows the same mindset: control wind, control moisture, and keep a stable interior. And when snow seals the outside, the system reaches peak efficiency like a layered coat around a living core. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. So why did Viking villages never truly freeze? Because they refused to waste heat. Shape fought wind. Turf trapped still air. Animals added living warmth. Doors and vestibules killed drafts. The hearth provided heat and light. The roof layered bark and turf. Snow sealed the outside like a blanket. If you want more stories about Viking survival ships, weapons trade, or daily life, leave a comment with your topic. And if you stayed to the end, like and subscribe so you do not miss the next journey into the past. Now you know the truth. Viking villages did not never freeze because winter was kind. They resisted freezing because the longhouse was a complete heat strategy. Shape reduced wind impact. Turf trapped still air. Entrances killed drafts. Animals added constant warmth. The hearth provided heat, light, and cooking. The roof layered bark and turf. Snow sealed everything. If you enjoyed this deep dive, write a comment telling me which Viking technology you want next: ships, weapons, trade routes, or daily life. And please like and subscribe so you do not miss the next journey into the past. If any part of this surprised you, tell me which one: the turf walls, the animal heat, the windowless darkness, or the snow insulation. Your comments help shape the next video. And if you want more calm, deep dives into survival technology of the past, like and subscribe. The next journey is already waiting. And when snow seals the outside, the system reaches peak efficiency like a layered coat around a living core. If you have ever felt a single cold draft ruin an entire room, you already understand their obsession. Notice how nothing here is complicated. It is just careful, layered thinking applied again and again. Before we move on, pause and picture the room in your mind. The more clearly you see it, the more each next detail will click into place.